The clock read 9:07 a.m. as Jamal Richardson parked his car in the lot outside the municipal courthouse in Jackson, Mississippi. The morning sunlight cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Jamal exhaled deeply. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his professional life revolved around discipline and preparedness. But today, life had conspired against him. This wasn't supposed to be a complicated morning. The task ahead was mundane, challenging an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother left him. The city had raised the taxes inexplicably, and Jamal had spent weeks gathering proof that it was a mistake. The house was more than property to him. It was the anchor of his childhood, the place where he had learned right from wrong under his grandmother's watchful eye. Dressed in a dark navy suit with a crisp white shirt, Jamal looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was, even if his morning had been far from smooth. An urgent phone call about an ongoing human trafficking case had delayed him. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Jamal couldn't ignore it. He had reviewed the motion and provided feedback to his team before rushing to court, knowing he was cutting it close. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A quick glance showed a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "The judge in Jackson has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful." Jamal sighed, tucking his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried. Facts were his weapon, and he came armed with evidence. But something in the message lingered. He shook it off as he stepped into the cool interior of the courthouse. The municipal court wasn't like the federal courts where Jamal spent most of his days. The walls were a dull beige, the seats scuffed from decades of use, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Despite its worn appearance, the place buzzed with activity. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents, faces etched with anxiety over parking tickets, minor disputes, and other small claims. Jamal checked his watch. 9:13 a.m., 12 minutes to spare, barely enough time to find the correct courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing people speaking in hushed tones. Room 2015. Judge Samuel Whitman was etched in brass on the door. Jamal adjusted his tie and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling with people. Jamal found a spot near the back and sat down, flipping open his folder to review his evidence. As he scanned his notes, he noticed the judge entering the room. Judge Samuel Whitman, a tall man with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, commanded attention without saying a word. His reputation as a no-nonsense figure was evident in the way he scanned the room, his sharp gaze missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room shuffled to its feet. Jamal joined in, his posture straight as the judge settled into his chair. Jamal noticed the stark silence that followed. Judge Whitman began calling cases one by one with mechanical efficiency. His tone was crisp and detached. Jamal watched closely as a middle-aged man in a suit, arriving a few minutes late, shuffled into the room unnoticed. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes slipped in and took a seat. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Finally, at 9:25 a.m., Jamal heard his name called. He gathered his folder and made his way to the podium, projecting calm despite the slight delay. As he approached, Judge Whitman looked up, his expression hardening. Jamal felt the shift in the room, a quiet tension that hadn't been present for the previous cases. "You're late, Mr. Richardson," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Jamal raised his hand slightly, palms out in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." Jamal felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, but he maintained his composure, choosing his next words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." Judge Whitman waved a hand dismissively. "We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $500. The words hung in the air like a hammer striking an anvil. Jamal's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Around him, murmurs rippled through the room. "Your Honor," Jamal began. His tone calm and measured, Caleb Thompson spoke. "May I explain?" The judge raised his gavel, silencing him immediately. "You may not," Judge Whitman interrupted sharply. "Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Caleb stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tardiness. It was about something deeper, something that many in the room had likely seen before. He glanced briefly at the other latecomers, none of whom had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring, and Caleb wasn't about to let it slide. As he returned to his seat, he opened his folder, but this time it wasn't the property tax documents he focused on. Caleb began jotting notes, his pen moving swiftly across the page. The judge, meanwhile, continued with the next case, his voice unwavering. Caleb knew one thing for certain: this was no ordinary morning. Caleb sat in the back row, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and observations. The courtroom proceeded in its rhythm, but Caleb couldn't shake the blatant disparity he had just witnessed. He replayed the moment Judge Whitman imposed the $500 fine, contrasting it with the indifference shown to others who had arrived late. The young woman who had slipped in earlier sat near the front, scrolling on her phone, untouched by reprimand. A man in a gray blazer, now presenting his case, had clearly walked in after the judge began, yet the gavel's ire had been reserved solely for Caleb. This wasn't an isolated moment, it was a pattern. Caleb could recognize it as plainly as the documents in his briefcase. He turned to his legal instincts, assessing the situation with precision. A fine this steep for tardiness in municipal court was extreme, even punitive. He noted the expressions of those around him, a mix of disbelief, discomfort, and curiosity. Caleb could tell that others in the room were thinking the same thing, but no one dared to speak. "Next case," Judge Whitman announced. Caleb's name echoed in the room again. Caleb stood, his stride calm and deliberate as he returned to the podium. The judge fixed him with the same piercing gaze, as if daring him to falter. "Your Honor, I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment," Caleb began. "The property has been in my family for decades, and these adjustments do not align with the city's assessed values." He placed the folder on the podium, opening it to reveal neatly organized documents and photographs. He gestured toward a specific page. "This shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment, however, reflects a 30% increase without proper notification or explanation." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of disinterest. "I'll review it in due time, Mr. Thompson. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe that the urgency of your federal responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court?" Caleb's composure remained intact. "Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we all agree requires immediate attention." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone didn't waver. "Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason." It wasn't the words themselves that struck Caleb. It was the unspoken tone of dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation wasn't good enough. His professional achievements, his character, even his effort to respect the system, none of it mattered in this room. Caleb took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" A ripple of unease passed through the room. The judge stiffened, the color in his face deepening. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Thompson?" "I'm asking for clarity," Caleb replied, his tone even. "It's important to ensure that fairness is upheld, not just for myself, but for everyone here." The judge's gavel came down sharply. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands." Caleb inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor." He returned to his seat, feeling the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him. He could sense the quiet admiration of some and the trepidation of others. This wasn't the first time Caleb had encountered bias cloaked in authority, but something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for what he would do next. Caleb pulled out his phone discreetly, typing notes. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. He made a quiet decision then and there. This situation wouldn't end here. The courtroom continued its routine, but Caleb's presence had already shifted the energy in the room. The atmosphere shifted. Others noticed it too. An older black man sitting 2 rows ahead turned slightly, offering Kendrick a brief, knowing glance. The court clerk, her fingers flying over the keyboard, occasionally hesitated, her discomfort visible. When the session ended, Kendrick lingered for a moment as people filed out. He observed the way they carried the unspoken weight of what had transpired. A young law student sitting in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook, her expression one of awe and determination. Kendrick left the courtroom with his briefcase in hand, his thoughts already forming a plan. This was no longer about a property tax adjustment or even the fine. This was about something much larger, something he couldn't ignore. As Kendrick exited the courtroom, the crisp air outside offered no relief from the tension that still clung to him. The courthouse buzzed with the mundane movements of everyday proceedings, but inside Kendrick's mind, a decision was solidifying. He paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his assistant, the U.S. attorney back at the office. "No," he muttered to himself. "Not yet." He stepped aside to review his notes again. The interactions he had witnessed and experienced in Judge Whitman's courtroom painted a clear picture. The disparity wasn't incidental, it was structural. Kendrick's legal instincts told him he now had the seeds of a much larger case, one that went beyond property taxes or even his personal treatment. Back in his car, Kendrick opened his briefcase, pulling out his badge and credentials. The federal prosecutor's emblem, embossed in gold, reflected the sunlight streaming through his windshield. He decided this would be the first move. By the time he re-entered the courtroom, most of the morning cases had concluded. The room was quieter, though a few stragglers remained, flipping through papers or waiting for their turn. Judge Whitman was leafing through documents, his demeanor calm but visibly tired. Kendrick walked confidently toward the bench, his badge and identification in hand. As he approached the podium, the court clerk raised her eyes, her fingers pausing mid-tap. Judge Whitman glanced up, his irritation returning almost instantly. "Mr. Thompson, the court session has concluded," he said curtly. "If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment." "With respect, Your Honor," Kendrick began, his voice carrying a quiet authority, "I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." He held his badge up slightly, making sure it was clearly visible to everyone in the room. "I'm Kendrick Thompson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, focusing on cases of human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hands stilling over the papers he was handling. The color drained from his face as Kendrick's words registered. Around the room, the remaining spectators watched intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "I was late this morning because of an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention," Kendrick continued, his tone firm but respectful. "And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today." Judge Whitman's lips pressed into a thin line. "But Mr. Thompson, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint." "I've already begun documenting the events of this morning," Kendrick replied, holding up his notebook. "Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, clearly uneasy. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct?" "I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor." Kendrick said calmly. As a federal prosecutor, I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice is applied equally, regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns. The silence in the room was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously between Kendrick and the judge, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The young law student in the back corner was furiously jotting notes, her eyes wide with fascination. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the appropriate channels. I intend to, Your Honor, Kendrick replied. But I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom. Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He had presided over this courtroom for decades, but today Kendrick had forced him to confront something he hadn't wanted to see. Judge Whitman's authority had rarely been questioned so directly. For the first time, it seemed, his confidence faltered. "You may go, Mr. Robinson," the judge said, his voice quieter now. Kendrick collected his credentials and turned to leave, but stopped for one final statement. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly." As Kendrick walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he could feel the eyes of every remaining spectator on his back. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself, it was about challenging a broken system, one that had long turned a blind eye to its own flaws. Outside, Kendrick pulled out his phone, already typing an email to his office. He documented every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed. When he hit send, he knew this was just the beginning. The email Kendrick sent that afternoon moved faster than he anticipated. By the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. His supervisor, Julia Harper, a seasoned attorney with decades of experience, spoke with urgency. "Kendrick, I read your report," she said. "If what you're describing is accurate, it's not just a one-off situation. This is systemic. It's a huge issue." "I believe it does," Kendrick replied, voice steady. "What I witnessed yesterday wasn't an isolated event. It's part of a deeper, ingrained pattern that I'm sure others have experienced too." Julia exhaled sharply. "I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately but thoroughly. In the meantime, I need you to gather every piece of evidence you can find. This is bigger than just one case." The call ended, but Kendrick's work was far from over. He spent hours gathering details from the municipal court session. He combed through public records, noting discrepancies in the fines and penalties issued by Judge Whitman. The data painted a disturbing picture. Black defendants were fined significantly more than their white counterparts for similar offenses. Late arrivals from white defendants were often ignored, while black defendants faced harsh reprimands or heavy fines. Kendrick reached out to colleagues, community members, and fellow attorneys who had appeared in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The responses flooded in. Stories of mistreatment from black defendants, some shared publicly, others anonymously. A black mother recounted how she was fined $500 for contesting a zoning issue, even though clear evidence showed the city was at fault. Another person described how Judge Whitman belittled him, questioning his worth before dismissing a case for a white defendant with similar circumstances. Local activist groups were quick to join the fray, organizing rallies and demanding accountability outside the Greenville courthouse. Protesters flooded the steps with signs reading, "Justice is blind," and "End bias now." Kendrick, however, chose to focus on the legal battle ahead, avoiding the public spectacle as much as possible. But he couldn't ignore the significance of what was happening. The pressure was mounting. Staff members who had worked with Judge Whitman for years began to come forward. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, became a crucial figure in the investigation. She handed over a notebook she'd kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said during an interview. "But now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." Even James Wilson, the bailiff, spoke up. I've seen this kind of treatment for years. It's wrong, and it's long past time something was done." Meanwhile, the story continued to make waves across the local community. A young law student who had witnessed the exchange between Kendrick and Judge Whitman posted a detailed account on social media. The post gained traction quickly, with hundreds of people sharing similar stories of discrimination in courtrooms around the country. The pressure grew, and soon enough the headlines changed. Bias in Greenville courtroom, federal prosecutor challenges judge's conduct. News outlets rushed to cover the story, and Kendrick found himself in the spotlight, his name at the center of an explosive legal and social issue. Calls from reporters came non-stop, but he remained focused on the investigation. Judge Whitman, meanwhile, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. Rumors began circulating that he had been summoned to several private meetings with judicial oversight committees. While he publicly denied any wrongdoing, privately, the mounting pressure forced him into damage control. Kendrick, despite the flood of attention, stayed grounded in his mission. He continued his work as a federal prosecutor, knowing that his responsibilities went far beyond just this case. But the messages pouring into his office from across the country, emails, phone calls, and letters, were overwhelming. Some offered support, while others shared similar stories of bias and discrimination in courts from all over the nation. One letter in particular stood out. A retired attorney from Alabama wrote, "For years I saw the same injustices you're describing, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." The movement grew beyond Greenville. Other judges in South Carolina came under scrutiny as reporters and activists began digging into court records. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced a broad review of municipal courts, vowing to root out systemic bias. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission completed its preliminary report. The findings were devastating, and the implications were clear. Judge Whitman's actions were part of a larger and deeply embedded problem. The report called for immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the establishment of independent oversight committees. The pressure became too much for Judge Whitman. Faced with the prospect of a public hearing and potential disciplinary action, he announced his resignation in a brief statement. "I believe it's in the best interest of this court and this community that I step aside," he said. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. The announcement of Judge Whitman's resignation sent ripples through the courtroom. A moment that seemed like a victory was overshadowed by the reality of how deep the issue ran. Caleb Thompson knew that this was just one battle in a long war against systemic racism and inequality. Though the resignation was a public acknowledgement of the allegations, the work didn't end there. Caleb felt a renewed sense of responsibility, knowing the implications of the report went far beyond a single judge. The Judicial Review Commission's preliminary report called for sweeping reforms: mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the creation of independent oversight committees. It was clear that this was only the beginning. As the news of Judge Whitman's resignation made headlines, Caleb had a new challenge ahead, ensuring the changes proposed in the report were not just words on paper. The media kept the pressure on, demanding more accountability. While the public celebrated this small victory, Caleb knew there was more to be done to reshape the system and build trust with those who had been marginalized for far too long. Local protests continued, but Caleb didn't get caught up in the spectacle. He returned to his work as a federal prosecutor, knowing that this moment was part of a larger, ongoing movement. He continued collaborating with the Judicial Review Commission, providing evidence and making sure the momentum didn't die down. Over the coming weeks, activists, lawyers, and community leaders joined the cause. Caleb's office received countless messages from people across the country, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of bias they had experienced in courtrooms. One letter in particular stood out. It came from a retired attorney in Alabama who had witnessed similar injustices throughout his career but had never spoken out. "For years, I saw the same injustices you're describing, the letter read, "but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." The ripple effect from the events in Greenville spread across the state of South Carolina, with increased scrutiny on other judges. Reporters and activists began digging into case records, uncovering more instances of bias within municipal courts. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee took swift action, launching an in-depth review of all municipal courts, vowing to root out systemic bias once and for all. By the end of the month, Caleb's efforts had started to yield results. The Judicial Review Commission completed its full report, which made clear that Judge Whitman's actions were not an isolated incident. The findings underscored a deeply embedded problem within the judicial system that could no longer be ignored. The recommendations were bold: mandatory training for all judges, routine audits of decisions, and the formation of independent bodies to oversee and enforce accountability. These were critical steps, but Caleb knew the real challenge lay ahead: ensuring the changes would be implemented and not just forgotten. The pressure was mounting for Judge Whitman. Though he had resigned in the wake of public outcry, the damage to his career was done. His resignation came as an acknowledgement of his failure, but Caleb didn't feel the satisfaction he thought he might. This wasn't about personal victories. It was about justice and the need for long-lasting change. As Caleb walked into his office that afternoon, the weight of the case and the movement he had helped spark settled in his chest. The future was uncertain, but he knew he had set something in motion. The fight for equality was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this. The people who stood with him, those who had come forward to speak out, those who had shared their stories, had proven that change was possible. Some viewed Judge Whitman's resignation as an admission of guilt, while others saw it as a necessary step toward healing. For Kendrick, it was a moment of vindication, but not a celebration. The resignation was only the first step. The real work was just beginning. As reforms began to take shape, Kendrick found himself thrust into a new role. He was invited to speak at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences about his experience and the importance of challenging systemic bias. His story became a beacon for young lawyers, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, showing them that justice was something to fight for. At one such event, a young black law student approached Kendrick after his speech. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules," the student said, his voice filled with admiration. "It's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled, humbled by the words. "The fight is just beginning," he said. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after the morning that set everything in motion, the courthouse in Greenville looked markedly different. The tired beige walls were freshly repainted, and a new welcome desk greeted visitors as they entered. Signs in multiple languages directed people to resources they hadn't known were available before: payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides. A small but meaningful plaque was installed near the entrance: "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside the courthouse, changes were even more pronounced. Judge Whitman was no longer presiding, having quietly stepped down after his resignation. In his place, a younger judge with a reputation for fairness and impartiality had taken over. More importantly, systemic reforms were already underway. All court personnel were now required to attend bias training, led by experts who tackled the subtle ways discrimination could seep into decision-making. Kendrick stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the room. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and lawyers about the changes that had been implemented. As he waited for his turn, he felt a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. Change had begun, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. The reforms extended far beyond Greenville. Inspired by Kendrick's actions, other communities in South Carolina and eventually across the country began reevaluating their own court systems. State judicial review boards implemented mandatory audits of case outcomes, with particular attention paid to racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees, composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants, were established to monitor court proceedings and ensure accountability. In Kendrick's office, the momentum was palpable. His fine from that fateful morning now hung framed on his wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why he had taken a stand. Below it was a photo from a recent event, a group of young law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, and Kendrick couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds in the community. The ripple effects were equally significant. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had served under Judge Whitman, was now leading bias training sessions for court officers. At one of his sessions, he addressed a room filled with new hires. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he said, his voice firm. "It's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose records had been instrumental in the investigation, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly, mentoring younger clerks and ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. Kendrick's influence extended beyond the legal community. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school, focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, many of whom were inspired by his story, often stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" the student asked. Kendrick thought for a moment, then replied, "To start by recognizing that fairness isn't just about rules. It's about treating people with dignity. If we don't look beyond the surface, we'll never see the real changes we need to make." "Listen to each other," Kendrick began, his voice steady. "Listen to the people who come through our courts and to those who are too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." The changes weren't without resistance. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the new oversight measures, claiming they undermined their authority. But the evidence was undeniable. Within a year, the data showed a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences in Greenville's municipal court. Payment plans were approved more often, and defendants reported feeling treated with more respect. For Kendrick, the most rewarding moments came from the people who approached him to share their stories. One such encounter was with an elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that morning months ago. He returned to thank Kendrick. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally said, 'Enough. Thank you for giving us hope.'" One morning, Kendrick received a letter in his office. It was from a young public defender in Chicago who had read about his story and been inspired to start her own investigation into biases in her local courts. The letter ended with a simple but powerful line. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Kendrick read the letter twice before placing it in a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. It wasn't about him. It never had been. This was about the countless voices that had been silenced or ignored for too long. Voices that were finally being heard. Months later, Kendrick walked back into the courthouse where it had all begun. He wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center, named in part after his efforts. As he stepped to the podium, he looked out at the crowd. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members filled the room, their faces a mix of anticipation and gratitude. "Justice isn't just about laws," Kendrick began. "It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause was thunderous, but Kendrick's focus was on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of real change. and he knew that while the work was far from over, this was a step in the right direction.